Good morning, everyone. My name is Sarayan Mukherjee. I'm the director of the Intermedia Research Studio at the Department of Sociology and a Climate Resilience Fellow with the Kule Institute of Advanced Studies at the University of Alberta. I'm speaking to you today from Amiskauchewa here in Treaty 6 territory, also known by its colonial name of Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. Today is the second and final event of the Kule Scholars Program set of events on ecofeminism and degrowth. The theme of our program today is Ecofeminist Degrowth and a Feminist Green New Deal, and we are very fortunate to have with us three researchers from the Feminisms and Degrowth Alliance research network to help us think through the issues raised by GND politics today: Mariam Abazeri, Stefania Barca, and Saave. Before I formally introduce our seminar roundtable leaders, I want to remind you that our meeting today is being recorded, and I want to observe our land acknowledgement by connecting it to our seminar theme. Discussions of a Green New Deal have been taking place in Canada, as well as in other parts of the world, notably the United States, the United Kingdom, and the EU. There is even considerable discussion of a global Green New Deal, as well as some discussion, a lot less, of a People's Green New Deal. Along these more radical lines, Professor Barca presented yesterday a set of principles for a specifically feminist Green New Deal. As Dr. Barca and Dr. Aluk noted yesterday, discussions of any Green New Deal inescapably pose innumerable thorny questions regarding the contradictions of patriarchal state power and of the colonial histories of capital formation through which the modern imperial and neo-colonial states now form a hierarchical world system. These histories too often get overlooked in other GND proposals, which also share a common thread evoked by the name of such politics, which references Roosevelt's New Deal forged in the depths of the Great Depression. Roosevelt's New Deal, we should note, was a strategy for rescuing world racial capitalism and its imperialisms from revolutionary decolonization. The significance of our land acknowledgement today derives from its challenge to this normalized erasure of history in our contemporary political imaginaries. Hasty assumptions regarding the nominal sovereignty of the Canadian nation state or the ahistorical naturalness of capital, made in some discussions of a Green New Deal or a just transition, rarely take on the kind of historical, constitutional, and political theorizing required to honor treaties or decolonize the state into some kind of world federalism. And yet, the political imaginary of the Green New Deal crystallizes a concrete possibility for political praxis, locally and globally, in which the long history of anti-racist, anti-imperialist, feminist politics and movement building certainly has a leading role to play. Even though our speakers here today are under no obligation to address Canadian GND discussions, let us nevertheless listen to our territorial acknowledgement with these observations in mind. The University of Alberta respectfully acknowledges that we are located on Treaty 6 territory, a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence our vibrant community. It's now my great pleasure to introduce our roundtable speakers. Mariam Abazeri is a doctoral candidate in ecosystem science and policy at the University of Miami. Her interests lie at the nexus between visual media, environment, and culture. Her current research focuses on the role that participatory visual methods play in representing gender justice and collective water governance in Iran. She is a member of the Works on Water research creation community, a producer of the film Women of the Sun, A Chronology of Seeing, and teaches visual and environmental anthropology at various universities. Professor Stefania Barca is a distinguished researcher in the Department of History at the University of Santiago de Compostela. Originally from Italy, in the last 12 years, she has worked as a senior researcher at the Center for Social Studies of the University of Coimbra. In 2021, she held the position of Zenstrom Professor in Climate Change Leadership at the University of Uppsala. She also received sabbatical grants from the universities of Lund and Berkeley, and her research interests are in environmental history and political ecology, with a focus on the industrial age. Her book, Enclosing Water, Nature and Political Economy in a Mediterranean Valley, was awarded the Turku Book Prize in 2011. Her latest book, Forces of Reproduction, Notes for a Counter-Hegemonic Anthropocene, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2020. She's active in feminist, climate justice, and degrowth networks, and her work has been translated and disseminated in several languages. Dr. Anna Saave is a postdoctoral researcher in feminist political economy with a background in environmental sciences and sustainability economics at Humboldt University in Berlin. She teaches feminist economics, political economy, and ecofeminism at various universities. Her dissertation, Appropriating and Externalizing the Inside-Outside Relation of the Capitalist Mode of Production, has been recently published. Having studied in Germany, Iceland, and the United States, her research focuses on the interconnections of care, reproductive work, and ecological processes within the capitalist mode of production. Dr. Saave will begin our proceedings for us with a formal presentation titled Why Better Finance of the Care Sector Might Hack Capitalism, a proposal for transitioning to a care degrowth society. After this, I will invite first Dr. Barca and then Mariam Abazeri to take up the questions of a feminist Green New Deal, either by responding to issues raised by Dr. Saave or by telling us more about FADA, the research network, and its important intervention in the space of degrowth research and politics. After all, FADA's intervention is very important in enabling these discussions we are now having about a feminist Green New Deal. And it will be helpful to folks on the call, I think, to learn about the politics FADA is attempting to activate. After Stefania and Mariam each offer their first thoughts, I'll open up the floor and invite all of you on the call to join in these discussions. Now, over to you, Anna.
Thank you, Surayan, for the invitation. I'm really glad to have the opportunity today to discuss a policy proposal with you and also with Stefania and Mariam, who I know through the FADA, the Feminism and Degrowth Alliance, and I'm eagerly looking forward to discussing these specific things today that I want to explain. Let me share my slides. Can you see that? Okay, great. So I'll start off the conversation with some reflections about how to hack capitalism through redistribution policies concerning the paid and unpaid care sector. I will conclude by pointing out how the policy proposal of a care tax links to policies such as a Green New Deal, and we'll hopefully deepen the discussion later together with Stefania and Mariam. So I'll start off the conversation with this policy proposal, but before we get into the details, the hack, so to say, let's pay some attention first to what the problem is. Stefania has also elaborated on that yesterday, so I can make it short. In short, capitalism is both an economic system that produces ecological externalities, and it also depends on cheap labor, and is therefore tightly connected to social hierarchies and inequalities that ensure and reproduce that some labor is and remains cheap. The capitalist mode of production also depends on conditions under which people seek paid jobs due to the limited subsistence opportunities they have beyond the job market. The ideologies that serve to legitimize the devaluation of certain groups of people and their work can occur separately from the capitalist mode of production. Yet this devaluation is essential for capitalism's survival, since in capitalism, businesses are compelled, or at least structurally strongly encouraged, to operate using the cheapest labor available. The possible points of intervention into the capitalist mode of production are, of course, many. Today, I want to focus on redistribution policies being one possible way of changing the status quo. And the intervention I will introduce requires the state for redistribution, as well as institutional and civil society support that advocate for a paradigm shift in thinking and values to carry such proposals and policies into action. As a background for this policy proposal, we need to remember that one important feature of how capitalism works is that it depends on social reproduction and care work for next to zero cost. Care work and social reproduction have to be done always, as we know, since they sustain life. But this kind of work doesn't come for free. To sustain care work, the carer always needs some amount of resources, be they financial resources or subsistence practices. When designing a policy proposal for the care sector, we also need to keep in mind that caring is a special kind of work. Caring is the everyday, bodily, recurring looking after and providing for others, and the knowledge and organization and responsibility that this requires. Caring takes time, and if the time for caring is reduced, the quality of the care provided suffers. These special characteristics of care work result in a dynamic that Mariam Abazeri, who is a feminist economist from Switzerland, calls diverging productivities. Compared, for example, to the manufacturing sector, in care work, there are relatively clear limits to productivity growth. This is because services in the labor-intensive care economy, paid and unpaid, cannot be made more efficient at will. Some activities can be made more productive because a part of them can be automated, like, for example, large parts of manufacturing or even farming. But the productivity of care services, however, cannot always be increased. So in comparison, the productivity of care work appears to be rather steady, which results in diverging productivities. So the limited rationalization of care work is also one reason why it only allows for relatively low profit margins on the free market. Despite the fact that paid care work is undervalued also today, it is still rather expensive for possible buyers. So the demand is there, but not the purchasing power, which in turn leads to a huge cost and time reduction pressure on all kinds of care work. According to the feminist economist Susan Donath, the cause of such cost reduction pressure on care are those diverging productivities. To achieve a better provision of care, societies need to intervene in this dynamic so that they can reduce this resulting pressure. Now, how can a society intervene? Another feminist from Switzerland, Tove Säuland, she's a feminist theorist, was the first to propose a care tax in 2014. This idea, of course, originates from a Central European context and tries to answer the question how care can be organized in developed capitalist industrial societies. So it stems from this region, and it also stems from her activism together with healthcare workers who were attempting to unionize. She elaborates on the care tax by comparing an intervention in diverging productivities in the care sector with ecological taxes that are already implemented in Germany and Switzerland. So she connects the two policy fields to help people imagine that an intervention is possible, and efforts to advocate for similar interventions have already been done successfully. Säuland proposes a tax to better finance the care sector, both paid and unpaid. And I show in more detail in a study from 2019 what kind of policy design is required to replicate the mechanics behind environmental redistribution and to apply this to the care sector. For now, I will focus on one specific version of the care tax that is especially promising for creating a caring economy. This care tax redistribution could possibly hack capitalism and intervene in a profoundly transformative way, which is why economist Adelheid Biesecker calls the care tax a possible Trojan horse, but more on this in a moment. So based on those insights from feminist economics, a care tax can be spelled out as follows. The care tax is a taxation of profits from productivity increases and their redistribution to the care sector. So this means in some sectors in the economy, which are characterized by large productivity increases, there is taxation applied. And the resulting tax revenue is collected and redistributed to the societally necessary care sector, which is characterized by low productivity gains. Tove Sollert and Masha Madörin, who I already mentioned, propose corporate taxes for such a project. What is exactly taxed is to be determined. It could be the profits from productivity increases in every single company, or it could be the turnover of a company in a specific sector, or a percentage of the turnover of companies in certain industries, also maybe financial transactions. So the concrete basis for taxation must be weighed up in light of the financing needs of care and in democratic processes. What is to be gained by this? The redistribution of profits from productivity increases and the resulting increased funding of care can improve the direct working conditions of caregivers, as well as the living conditions of care receivers. It could also break existing power relations in the care sector that are perpetuated by low wages. We heard a lot about that yesterday. Societies need such a redistribution since a care infrastructure does not finance itself. The current lack of funding has instead unacceptable consequences, and those were even further exacerbated in the COVID pandemic. So in the interest of a sustainable society, caring should not be further organized in structurally precarious ways that rely on the exploitation of cheap women's and migrant labor. This whole proposal does not necessarily imply a commodification of care. Instead, investments in care infrastructure or establishing a publicly funded common structure, etc., this all could be alternatives to commodification of individual activities. So for those of you who took part yesterday, let me add that the care tax proposal here is really focusing on where the money comes from. While Stefania explained yesterday the complementary side of how the necessary funds would be distributed following either principles of equal opportunities or entitlements. In mainstream economic terms, the care tax policy is unconventional. Under the mainstream economic framework, taxes are justified if they internalize an externality. Within this framework, only economic subjects can be influenced or may be influenced who cause an externality with their behavior. But processes cannot be interfered with because they are regarded as quasi-natural. What the care tax does, however, is intervene with the process of diverging productivities. And this is why taxing sectors with high productivity gains and channeling the resulting tax revenues to the care sector is novel and can be viewed as an innovation for a caring economy. Feminist economist Adelheid Biesecker from Germany says about the care tax, I prefer the care tax as an intervention in diverging productivities, since it seems like a Trojan horse. We start from this economic system, keep this conception of productivity for a while, but redistribute profits from productivity gains to enable better paid care work, which actually follows quite a different logic than just productivity. So Adelheid points here to an important paradigm shift that needs to happen. Implementing a care tax requires first to acknowledge the limited productivity of care when this is measured in conventional economic terms. The policy proposal itself asks which forms of productivity a society chooses to value. The hack here is, if we are serious about the amount of redistribution needed and the care tax is indeed applied, this will result in an entirely different incentive structure in national economies. So let me wrap this up. The crisis of care is often silent. Most of it is taking place in the private sphere, and a lot has been said about how caring responsibilities prevent paid care workers from going on strikes where care is organized by the market. Not only the COVID pandemic, but also the ecological trajectory that we are on will intensify the need for care in the future. And this is why we need to address structural problems around care more openly and find solutions. Yet the question of how to finance the care sector is often not talked about because adequate funding of high quality care services by the state would raise the question of a considerable redistribution of social wealth. Therefore, drastic increases in the wages of care work or public care infrastructures or other subsidies are not yet on the table. The care tax proposal would address what Brigitte Auenbacher and Maria Dammeier call the structural carelessness of capitalism. To counter this carelessness of capitalism, we need investments in care infrastructure, steady investments, because care work itself is constantly necessary. But the care tax policy can achieve even more. Societies can use redistribution policies like the care tax in the transition to a more sustainable low-carbon degrowth economy. Himmelweit, Dianou, and Lamniewska showed in a recent study that the investment in the care industry would create a higher number of jobs than investing in the construction sector. And this was something that was already pointed out yesterday by Stefania and Angel. So care work is less resource and energy intensive, and an investment in care jobs would thus help countries to achieve their sustainability and emission reduction goals. An investment in care also plays a key role when societies transition from fossil energy to renewable energy, as Paula Walk and colleagues have recently investigated. Previous coal phase-outs, they found out, have often led to women entering the labor market, as men in the coal industry lost their jobs. The women found employment, especially in the service sector, where on average the pay was significantly lower and the working conditions worse than in male-dominated sectors. So to support regions where a phase out of coal, for example, of coal is taking place, investments in the care sector can reduce hardships on households. So it has been my pleasure to share these reflections and proposals from the feminist economics perspective with you, and they are directed at financing the care sector in a better way, which benefits societies as a whole, and it can be easily integrated into an ecological policy agenda.
Thank you.
My turn?
Yes, thank you, Anna, for these eloquent and incisive ideas. Stefania, your first response to these thoughts.
Okay. So, well, thank you very much, Anna. I think this continues very beautifully the conversation that we already we started yesterday. And I just I took notes while you were speaking. It's the first time I hear of this care tax, so I was very interested, and I have mostly questions. Let's say that generally speaking, I am on the same, let's say, on the same page, no? In the sense that we already talked about it yesterday. We do need radical realist policy proposals. So, when you speak in terms of Trojan horse, it makes me think in terms of also of more classical revolutionary reformism, or you know, this kind of approach that supposedly would bring about a new order of things once you reach some once you establish some premises, no? So the premise here should be equalizing care work with on other kinds of work. Let's call them extractive work, no? Because I think that extraction is the opposite of caring. So if you invest in caring work, this would center it socially and economically. It would make care work hopefully the most relevant economic sector in society. And this is also what the degrowth movement is currently also talking about. So the degrowth movement has introduced these talks of centering care and social reproduction in the last few years, I think. So this is a very welcome new entry in the degrowth policy agenda, and I think this is this is important, no? the point is that not the point, but the question is, first of all, the Trojan horse metaphor works only if you are the Greek. But what if you are the Trojans? I mean, if we think if you change our perspective, no, we run a risk that this tax, care tax, would lock us into a system that is still dependent on GDP growth, and GDP growth, as we know it, is strictly and firmly linked to fossil capitalism, racial capitalism, yeah, and not only capitalism, to be honest, any kind of productivist and militarist economic system and political system. So this reminds me of the Fordist Pact somehow, no? That we in industrialized countries already went through this, and the whole leftist parties and trade unions bought into this. The promise that compromising with capitalism and for workers to accept the logic of increasing productivity would benefit them in the end, because it would increased productivity would make GDP grow, and GDP growth would allow for more money to be spent in social policies. So, you know, when I hear this care tax, I immediately, as an economic historian by training also, immediately I start, you know, panicking about this possible locking in the system. So I was wondering if there is already some reflection on this, if there is already some answer to this. I would be very happy if so. And yeah, the other thing, also provocation, let's say question provocation would be, since the care tax is compared to an ecological tax, I would like to know more about this ecological tax in the sense of how did it work, and what results did it give? Because I mean, ecological tax to me it reminds of the polluter payer principle. No, you pollute. The more you pollute, the more you pay. So, and the polluter payer, it's something that the environmental justice movement and scholarship has heavily criticized, because it commodifies pollution itself, in the sense that it gives you right to pollute, because it's based on the principle of equivalence, of money equivalence. So you can pollute as long as you pay for it. And so don't we run the risk here of establishing starting from the principle that the equivalent of pollution in the care sector could be depletion, no? So are we not establishing a principle, a kind of depleter payer principle? I don't know. This is just some quick thoughts reacting to your talk. Thank you.
Mariam, I'd like to invite you to speak about what you think about all of this, or to talk about FADA and your involvement with that research network. It's over to you.
Thank you. So that was a very, very beautiful presentation, very eloquent, very provocative ideas that you put out there. Just to follow up first with some thoughts that I had about a care tax. my idea is, it does sound that there is some kind of, like, it sounds like it's a transition, and in a way it's a way to move away from this kind of economy. But one of the thoughts that just quickly came to mind as well was the idea of, in many ways, this continues to institutionalize the people and the social arrangements of who is already participating in care to begin with. So if you have certain people that would be better compensated for care, it's not necessarily restructuring who takes the care work on, it's only compensating them in a better way. And my concern of this is that in many ways, it's not questioning where the division of labor is, how it's divided and who takes care of that. And so within the gender divide, but also not just gender, but geographic as well. And so I think that these things need to also be brought into the discussion if we're going to talk about how to better compensate and better prioritize care. So that's just one of the things that quickly came to mind. I don't know, should I present now about FADA or, yeah, okay. So I'm a member of the Feminisms and Degrowth Alliance board, and as is Anna and Stefania, and well, Anna and I are on the board, Stefania is part of the group. And so this is, it started out as a collective during some of the degrowth conferences back in like 2016 and then 2018 when we met again. And it was, it became very, we became very aware that degrowth, where it is a proposal for reimagining alternative economies that are more socially and productively and reproductively inclusive, it's still leaving out a lot of the gender analysis out of the discourse. And so this is how the FADA Alliance became an initiative in degrowth, and really it has tried to get more into a central position of what degrowth is in general. So I have like a very quick, I just have like a slide that if, let me present that, share screen. Okay. Desktop. Okay. Hold on. Okay, you know what? I can't do it. Never mind. So anyway, it's basically, it's an interface. And so it brings together feminisms and degrowth. And so the idea behind it is that there is no degrowth without without feminisms and gender justice. And so it doesn't, environmental justice and how that is defined is not only through social justice, but also considering the gendered nature of injustices and oppression, as well as the role that gender plays in our lives because of how it's embedded in the family, the workplace, the communities, the state, foreign policy, even sexuality, language, and all of the constructs that encompass culture. And so there's this idea that practicing feminist degrowth is a process that is collective as well as ongoing and open. And so I invite anyone here to be a part of the collective. We have a listserv that serves as our primary means of communication that I can drop here in the chat. And for anybody that wants to be more of a coordinating member, the board is always looking for more help. So yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Mariam. I am going to give Anna a chance to respond to some of the questions that you folks have raised and so on. But at first, what I want to do is invite our audience to join in this conversation with your questions, observations, conversation, rejoinders, whatever. And I'll ask folks to use your raise hand tool so I can manage the turn taking. But while people are thinking about questions and so on, Anna, do you want to first respond to anything that people have asked you?
Yes, I will take this opportunity, and I have to say first that I agree with all the concerns that Stefania and Mariam have voiced. I think these are very relevant and extremely important for any policy proposal to unfold its really emancipatory potential. And if we don't make sure that, for example, the care tax is not embedded in a wider paradigm shift and wider set of policy designs, then it might just reinforce the same people in care jobs that are there right now, even though they are better paid. But then we still haven't solved this problem about prescribing a set of values to a certain gender and all the difficulties that come with these assumptions. So I don't think that the care tax is the silver bullet or one thing only that societies can or should do. Maybe comparing it to a UBI, if you introduce such policies and you don't work on a societal level for a re-evaluation of care work and for redistribution of care work among all genders, but also across regions, then this will have reinforcing effects on the social structure in societies and internationally, which is already there. So I completely agree. And redistributing care among all genders might also be necessary because the financing needs of care are really high. So one maybe paradox of this proposal of a care tax is that actually no country can afford to even pay all the people who care for free in their country with the minimum wage for the hours done, for the hours worked. So actually the total budget of a nation, for example, as Switzerland, Masha Modorian has done the accounting for that, it won't suffice to even guarantee a minimum wage if you would want to pay. And as I said, a care tax is a proposal that tries to give a possible answer to the question, where does the money come from? It doesn't necessarily say how it's going to be distributed, but still you have to know what sum you are trying to raise. And this is why all these considerations about minimum wage come in. Okay, so there were also many points from Stefania. Stefania, you were comparing pollution to depletion, and of course this language remains rather limited. But still, I think that when you use, for example, the language of depletion, that the care capacities in a society can be depleted, this can actually reach people, a lot of people. And when Tove Soiland proposed the care tax, comparing it to ecological taxes, she also wanted to reach people. So this was kind of a narrative coup or an instrument for her to say that we need redistribution here. But at the same time, and I'm not sure whether she has thought this through, she is not, she actually is not proposing a PIGU tax, and that was the ecological tax she was referring to. So it was a polluter pay system, but she is rather saying that we have to stop approaching the state promotion of care work like it were a charity for the people who do the care work. So some children's bonus and all this. She calls that charity, and she comes from the whole perspective of ecofeminism, and maybe you know the subsistence perspective of Mariam, who and those authors say that there is this iceberg, and a lot of the iceberg of unpaid work is not seen. And if we take this into account, how much this invisible part of work contributes to the accumulation of capital above the waterline, then what follows has to be a redistribution back to the underwater economy. And she actually wants to say that we have to stop charity, doing charity only. We have to really mediate the relationship between what's visible in the economy and what's invisible in a new way. Yeah, and I really think that using ecological taxes as an example is a narrative coup or a clue or an attempt, but we should not stop as feminist economists by replicating the mechanisms in ecological taxes. I completely agree with you, Stefania. And one last thought regarding the possible danger of a lock-in of this system. So you said that if we connect financing of the care sector to the profits that are created in the mainstream economy, then this might reinforce or perpetuate the mainstream economy, or at least the dependence of financing care work from the mainstream economy. And that is really a problem. But again, coming from the insight that we can hardly find the means to pay care workers in a nation a minimum wage if we want to pay all the unpaid care work, then it becomes paradoxical, because there will be no lock-in. There is so much, not only ecological, we are just talking about social and embodied debt here. There's so much embodied debt created that you cannot pay all of it back. So this policy proposal, in my eyes, is a vehicle for showing the absurdity of the status quo and laying it bare, because it won't work. And trying to apply this will end up in a situation where we really have to find new answers. And part of this will, of course, be the redistribution of care work among all people in society and internationally.
That was a very interesting set of thoughts you responded with there. I'm inviting our participants in the audience to join in the conversation. Laurie Adkin has asked a question in the chat, and I'm just wondering, Laurie, if you would rather not just speak your question to all of us at this point. Much better than me reading it out, I think, to hear your voice.
Trying to find my unmute button. Okay. Hi, everybody. This is just a wonderful discussion, and I just have this sense of, where have you been all my life? I miss you all, and somehow I didn't know you before, and I'm so happy to meet you. I'm old. I've been working on ecological economics since the 1980s, and I was really influenced by people like Andre Gortz and Alain Lippietz and the work on reduction of work time and the redistribution of productivity gains in the form of reduced work time and income to workers, so that you bring up the lowest paid workforce while basically you reduce the income of the highest paid workers because you reduce their work time. And Alain Lippietz also had a proposal for creating a third sector of socially useful work, which I won't go into, but there's a kind of a set of proposals there that it actually gained a lot of traction in the union movements, got a lot of support in France and Germany. They have had all kinds of problems and obstacles with reduction of work time and so on. But it still seems to me that the idea of tackling this problem of what was really nicely described as these differential productivity, gains and productivity growth, takes us back to this question of work time and family policy and how you redistribute income, and sort of discursively, or it's tackling this not so much as a tax on productivity gains, which immediately for me my reaction to that was, can you imagine mainstream economist reaction, I'm sure you can, to the idea of taxing productivity gains, which is their core idea of efficiency. What every enterprise wants to do is increase its productivity, right? I'm putting, air quotation marks here that you can't see, because, and yet what you could reframe this as a generation of unemployment, because you're just tossing people out of work and you don't care what happens to them afterwards, right? When you're increasing productivity. At the same time, as Andre Gorth said, well, we do want to actually replace human labor in some areas, right? Where we can. We want people to have more freedom from work. So I just wonder what people are thinking about proposals around reduction of work time, and also reforms in the area of family policy that have to do with allowing people to take time out of paid work during their life cycles when they need to raise children, to care for elderly parents or sick relatives and so on. And so that we start to privilege the life cycle needs over the needs of, capitalist economic efficiency and profit maximization. I think that there's some potential here for appealing to people's experiential needs, like what they've experienced in life is what they actually are suffering and need to improve their lives, without directly provoking or giving grounds, giving fuel to the mainstream economists to say, you're destroying everything that's productive about our economy, which I don't agree with, but I'm just making that point from a political point of view. I'll stop. Thank you.
Can I react right away, maybe? Thanks, Laurie, very much for sharing this, and also your background and your reflections on how colleagues from the economics department might react. I actually, even though I try to avoid it because it might end a hate crime, I had the chance to talk to mainstream economists about this, and they were infuriated because they said, what you're proposing is a penalty on innovation. And we don't want that. We need innovation. But, well, I can only copy that from Stefania, who is so great at really advocating for narrative justice. But I think this is a chance for narrative justice too. We have to take back the narrative. What's happening right now is not a penalty, or what would be happening is not a penalty on innovation. What's happening right now is a penalty on caring for people and planet. And this one has to stop. Yeah, and I would like to pass on the word to Stefania and Mariam for their reflections on the reduction of work time, because I have the feeling that you have worked on that.
The floor is, so whoever, the floor is open to whoever wants to jump in.
I am all in favor of work reduction. I just think it's not enough. That needs, as you were saying before, Anna, all these proposals need to be coordinated in a systemic way. So I think that this is the key. So this does not mean that we shouldn't focus and concentrate on one or the other particular, policy reform. But we always have to keep our minds on the big picture, on how each one of these proposals needs to be connected to other. And I think we also, this reminds me of something that has not directly to do with what we are discussing now, but more with what we were discussing yesterday. The fact that all these policy proposals that are thought of in the context of the state as public policies, as public state policies, they need to also keep in mind that we need to keep in mind that there is a global system, that capitalism is a global system based on global inequalities, and this is even very clear even in the care sector, no? Because of the global care chains that are today so clear and evident, no? So it's even more complicated, no? When you think of all this in a coordinated manner. The only way of doing that is really to have a convergence of different expertise and different social movements, each calling attention to perhaps one aspect of a systemic crisis. So yeah, and the other thing I wanted to say is about the money problem. No, where would the money come from? Because this is something that we have been asked also a question that I also asked myself in supporting the care income campaign. Where would the money come from? I mean, there are different ways of looking at that. There might be other possibilities as well. For example, a divestment, directly divesting from sectors where states are currently actually subsidize. For example, governments and also the European Union heavily subsidize not only the fossil fuel sector, but also, for example, in industrial farming. And these subsidies take direct public money to taxpayers' money to the wrong directions, to the wrong sectors. No? So by just divesting from those sectors and reinvesting the money in the care sectors could also be an alternative to taxing productivity increases in fossil fuels or industrial farming. No, of course, this does not solve all the problems. This would also create a problem of loss of jobs, as Laurie was rightly mentioning before. Divesting from the fossil fuel sectors will, of course, create loss of jobs in that sector. So there's nothing we can do about it. I think that there's no good reason for us to defend jobs in the fossil fuel sector. So other public policies should be also devised to make sure that the transition from one sector to the other is a just one in terms of social justice. But this is not a good reason to keep subsidizing the fossil economy. And one last thing, I was reading this book from Anne Pellifor, a British economist who has written a book, The Case for the Green New Deal. It's about the Green New Deal in the UK and where this Green New Deal has been put forward already since the early 2000s and or soon after the financial crisis. She says her point is that the money should come from the financial sector by deprivatizing the financial sector, by making, because she says we should consider money as a public good. So money should not be in private hands, the production of money. No, so the financial sector should not be in private hands. It should go back into public hands, like it was in the Bretton Woods system. And so this for her is one key point of a series of reforms that she proposes in the financial sector to address the problem of where the money comes from.
There's a couple of comments in the chat. So I'm going to invite Pierre Smith-Cunha to make your point audibly for all of us, and then Laurie as well.
Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, I mean, I was just agreeing with what Laurie had said, and maybe what we can ask what the panelists think of this, of the notion, which for me I think is a very powerful policy proposal that could make significant shifts, and it's to do with how to get more men into doing care work. So, I mean, one of the obvious ones is to have extended parental leave. That's non-transferable, and that fathers have to take. But that's only for fathers, no? Not all men are fathers, or some men are already fathers and wouldn't be able to take that leave. So I wonder if there are any thoughts on this, how to get more men into doing care work, because I really do feel that once you do care work, as many mothers and women do, it gives you a completely different perspective of life, of work, of time, and doing things fast, doing things slow, etc. And it just made me think now of what Anna was saying of how do we make that connection in the iceberg model, of the stuff that's over the water and the stuff that's underneath. How do we start to make those connections more visible? And again, I feel that men here have a huge role to play. Like, how do we educate or give life experiences to men to start to see those connections? Thanks.
You go ahead, Mariam.
Okay, thank you. So that I think that in terms of what I totally agree that there needs to be more time that is made available, whether that's through like increased paternity leave or reduced work hours. I think one of the issues, though, is that even if there are reduced work hours, studies have shown that it's not necessarily the number of hours that people are working that is resulting in the productivity. So it's not, I think that to begin with, we need to kind of separate the idea of productivity with work hours, but it's also of how people spend their time in that space, because there's also a fear that, even if a lot of men have this extra time, does that necessarily translate in appropriating that to care work? Or would that just end up having the division of labor maintained, where women are still having to do most of this care work while men have more time for themselves? And so I think that in itself is a cultural issue that needs to be addressed. But also, I think in general, with the idea of just care work as a sector of productivity is dangerous, for the reason that people can buy themselves out of that work. And I think that going to what you have just mentioned, Pierre, where it's the idea that some people have the privilege of not having to partake in that, and some people don't. And it's only until you do that you realize how labor intensive this is, and how much time and it reorients your idea of society and the function that society has in all of our relationships. And so I think that there is this kind of very delicate, I think maybe like a nexus of where, how we better compensate care work, but also not necessarily basing that on some idea of an exploitative path where certain people are still having to maintain that care labor. I think those are very difficult. And I mean, I would love to hear more thoughts on that.
There's a couple of comments in the chat. So I'll invite Lena first to speak her comment, and then Laurie, back to you.
I think Lina is on the phone now, and she has to take this phone call.
Oh,
But
okay.
maybe Laurie can share her thoughts.
Go ahead then, Laurie.
Sorry, I do know where the mute button is. It's just that my cursor won't go there. Yeah, I don't want it to monopolize time. I don't have much to add to what I've put into the comments. I just no, these are all excellent points, and I just wanted to add a few thoughts to them. And as somebody who's been thinking about what would a green transition look like in Canada, Sir Ian will remember my efforts in 2020 to try to create a network of academics and activists in Canada that would work on something like a blueprint for this. I really appreciated Stefania's comment about the kind of global embeddedness of whatever we try to do, and why we always have to think about the obstacles that presents to us. In the Canadian context, of course, we have our agreements with the NAFTA, the international trade agreements that our governments have negotiated that impose certain restrictions on things we can do around, nationalizing capitalist assets or restricting exports of things like fossil fuels. And so that's a context that's critically important for Canadians in thinking about transition to a more ecologically sustainable economy here. And it's interesting to think about in terms of the care sector too. I mean, there are these global corporations that are constantly trying to push in to healthcare and childcare and seniors care, assisted living, and so on, everywhere in the world, right? So there's a lot to think about there.
Can I jump in?
Sure, go ahead. And then after that, I'll invite Christopher to make his point.
Yeah, still reacting to what Pierre said, like what can you do to get more men caring? And adding to what Mariam has said, there are so many policies that are necessary here to really enable men to care. And this also has to do with household income, for example, in Germany, but I guess this also applies to the US. There's a marriage tax splitting law, and it benefits couples where there's one earner and earns a lot more than the other one. So there are tax reductions or tax savings for that. And of course, there's a whole set of things that you need to keep in mind to actually make people choose to care in case they're men, and in case they could earn more on the job market than maybe the other one. So then, Mariam, you said it doesn't help to think of care, paid and unpaid, in the light of productivity. And I totally agree. This productivity notion doesn't do care work justice at all, but still it is judged in this kind of way. And I think to be realistic, we need to work with it and turn it into something else. And then you also, Mariam, you also mentioned this cultural notion of, or the cultural paradigm and value shift that needs to happen. I just wanted to add to that feminists have developed great theories about externalization. For example, Bieseke and Hofmeister have developed a theory of externalization that connects ecological and social topics. And Roswitha Scholz and Beatrice Müller have developed a theory of externalization that connects externalization in the economic sense with psychological or psychoanalytic findings about externalization in the sense of abjection, in the sense of putting away some parts of you. And we need to do all of these. We need to include all those levels, because if male subjectivities rely on an externalization in the private life, then this will be replicated and mirrored in the economic sphere and arena. And so we cannot leave that out.
I'm going to invite Christopher to join in, and then back to you, Lina, after that.
Or Lina, my question would take us away from what we're currently focused on, and maybe your question was more directed to that? In which case, go ahead.
It was actually just a small notion because sorry, what was his name again?
Pierre?
But exactly, thank you. What Pierre said had this small notion of fathers and other men, so to say. And I was just thinking that, or this making a difference between that. And I think for care understanding, it's quite important also, in my opinion, to understand that care has very, like, a lot of different kind of facets, and actually all men could care for children, and it's not only, limited to fathers. This is just because I thought it was a small implicit notion, and I think we could think, or we should think of, in more than just a nuclear family, and maybe more in a communal sense. And this is just a small addition.
Christopher, go ahead.
Okay, I take it's okay to ask a question that shifts us in a different direction. Is that all right? Yeah, earlier when Stefania voiced the in response to Anna's talk around like locking it into, you know, continued capitalism, like the care tax is just locking in that thing. The question I'm trying to formulate briefly here is, I mean, what it sort of, that's like, I think it's a legitimate concern, totally legitimate, good question. But on the one hand, and that's the hand that, you know, a lot of people are very invested in. Let's keep global capitalism going. Let's keep growing, like no matter, and most people just don't seem to see alternatives, etc. But I want to really not minimize that hand, but just to emphasize the other hand, like, what about the, like, let's say a collapse perspective, that we are seeing a very long-term, uneven, non-linear process of collapse happening, and that people trying to keep capitalism going is just doomed, and they are going to double down. They're going to put more money into it. They're going to subsidize more stuff, even though it's gone. It should be, it's going away. And I'm just wondering if, and I really liked Anna's response in terms of, well, what the care tax proposal might actually accomplish is exposing the absurdity of this tax. Like, I thought that was a wonderful redirection of the thrust of the criticism. So I guess I'm asking about a similar redirection in terms of, would something like the care tax proposal, or maybe other proposals from Mariam or Stefania, because you're knowledgeable, would some of that like speak into, like, there is collapse that is just ongoing and we cannot keep it going? And would this, let's say, care tax proposal or other proposals, would they actually, like, I don't mean a pun here, but would they capitalize on some of these destabilizing things that are happening? Would they make an opportunity out of the collapse of this aspect of like, especially, let's say, supply chain stuff, right? When we, you know, Lori's comment about localizing things, like there's a lot more resilience there. There's care at a local level, both in terms of health and in terms of ecology and in terms of community, that would in fact be better. And maybe something like the care tax would in fact be a really positive proposal for strengthening the local in a way that we need to, as the global increasingly destabilizes and becomes, like, well, I think obviously unsustainable, but people are so invested in it that they're choosing not to see that. I'm trying to be brief here. Does this question make sense? Like recognizing that the system is increasingly, in my view, collapsing, would some of your proposals be good for like responding in healthy ways to that collapse, rather than perpetuating the old crappy system and patriarchy? Like, would they, like, are they speaking to those collapse points? If that makes sense. Sorry if that was badly worded.
Can I give a short answer? And yes, of course, this is why it is important to connect the feminist movements, feminist struggles for recognition of care work, which is a struggle 50 years old at least, with the current climate struggles, climate justice struggles, and with the degrowth also movement. This is why the convergence, it's among at least these three, but actually no. We also need very importantly, we need also convergence with the decolonial movements. So we need all of these together to make the point that we are at the point in which it's a matter of life or death to change the system. And so by how do we change the system? Because it's easier said than done, no? So how do we change the system? Here we have this policy proposal, this other, no? So these are little pieces of a puzzle, and the puzzle, so the big picture that we should see is the system change perspective. But to do that, that's why it's so important that the Global Women's Strike joined in the drafting of the Green New Deal for Europe report, because that was like something, because they've been campaigning around care work for 50 years and they had never made the connection with the environmental crisis and the climate crisis, and they came to it and they said, oh, this is really important, and we want to be part of this, and we want to be part of this with our perspective, and that's the perspective of the centrality of care work.
I would like to add to that, but by talking about what Stefania has written in her book. So in her book, The Forces of Reproduction, she explains that, well, not everything is collapsing. There are the forces of reproduction, and they try to be sustainable and to sustain themselves, and in some places that actually is successful and is continuing. So another strategy could be, apart from the policy proposals that require a capitalist industrialist state or a democratic state, apart from this whole set or this whole angle, you could also put the light somewhere else and show it on the alternatives that are already existing. And Stefania is pointing to forest dwellers in northern Brazil who are living sustainable lifestyles, and points out, sorry, Stefania, that I'm taking it up now. I hope I'm not hope I'm saying it right. So those people are murdered for their way of life, for protecting it. And this is part of the collapse, but it is also part of the solution, because we do not have to do all the inventions in the global north, in the centers. There are things happening in the peripheries, and we can redirect attention and energy to those and try to replicate what's already working.
Thank you for mentioning that, Anna.
Yes, excellent point. The floor is open, folks. I'm just doing a call out to see if anybody wants to jump in here. Mary, to catch a train. All right, well, I hope you make it. Well, as people are thinking, maybe I'll jump in with a thought or a question kind of thing. And it seems to me that our discussions so far, there's sort of two realms in which we've been grappling with these issues. One has to do with the question of institutions and what kinds of normative questions about how do we want things institutionalized and so on. And certainly one key dimension of this is in terms of a politics that has to do with care work not being a private crisis, but in the public sector in some important kind of way, right? That's the dimension of the kind of institution building discussion that we're having. And the other side of this is then a question of movement building, as Anna and Stefania were just talking about, in terms of a mass movement, both locally and globally, that would support certain kinds of policies. And I think that some of the things in terms of issues like a care tax, I mean, going back to that discussion about does this lock us into some kind of Keynesian sort of saving capitalism and until it finally just, we have planetary death in some kind of major way, that that policies that in fact do help people are going to gain support in ways that the accumulation of capital and all of the things that are becoming increasingly necessary to keep this game going, which is just deepening crises and harming people and their environments in deeper kinds of ways, right? So that's another aspect of, I think, the context in which we try to think through these very specific kinds of policies that that can be put out there for people to sort of say yes, or if they say no, that's a different thing altogether. Anyway, I'm going to stop here and just again do a call out for, yes, Mariam's got a question.
It's more of a response to what you just mentioned now. It reminds me of a lot of I mean, this has to do with just what Christopher was also talking about, the idea of a non-reformist reform. What are these kinds of reforms that you can propose that brings out what Anna said, the kind of just the paradox of the system that we're in right now. And it's in thinking about those that you have, I mean, the degrowth movement has been kind of very active in trying to center some of these kinds of non-reformist reforms, where you would have things like maximum income, or this idea of ethical financing, community-based financing, or cooperative firms. And I haven't read, Stefania, I haven't read your book yet, but it reminds me of some of the work that I've been doing, where the communities that I've been in Iran have kind of been, without necessarily connecting to environmental movements, there's certain pushes towards working back into cooperatives. And this idea of developing cooperatives and developing these kinds of more traditional means of governing certain resources is also being bridged with more inclusive practices of participation. So whereas in the traditional sense, you would have elder men being in charge of, let's say, water governance, in a more reformed sense, we have now younger women who are actively participating in that governance structure. And through cooperative financing, they're also becoming one of the larger stakeholders to be able to dictate how that governance of water is within a communal sense. So it's still very local, but maybe that is the point, is to keep these institutions local. And so it just has me thinking that where this discussion is going is that where, a lot of this has to do with bridging and building, but it's also looking, what Anna said about not necessarily thinking about, these things that haven't happened, but looking also at places where they have happened, and kind of connecting those together.
Just on that note, Mariam, we'll just briefly mention that here in Canada, there has been a proposal in the past by John Rostakis of organizing the care sector on cooperative grounds in a kind of public cooperative partnership. And I see that Mike Gismondi is here, and he's done a lot of work on the social economy in Canada. And of course, the social economy has been very important in some degrowth discussions as a strategy, right? In that regard. And I'm just wondering if people have other thoughts about how that articulation between a public sector and a cooperative or commons sector might look like, and so on, in terms of feminist politics in particular. That was a question to the room, to everybody here.
I was about to respond. I don't know if
Go ahead.
If it's a proper answer, but it makes me think of Brazil. In Brazil, the government is let's say the government gives land, public land, to communities of settlers organized as communities of land caretakers, let's say. So, and this is a very innovative form of land conservation, because of course it doesn't imply expelling people from the conservation areas. On the contrary, it links conservation to also to the people who but these do not need to be people who were there previously, no, because this is a different thing. This is you know, the indigenous territories. The Brazilian constitution also has a mandate to recognize indigenous lands, and in terms also of sovereignty. But this is a different thing. This is for communities of dispossessed peasants or forest dwellers, or people who might even choose to migrate from the city to back to the forest or to some other rural areas, organize themselves into sort of cooperative. It's not called cooperative, but it's yeah, that's what it is, and make a claim to get access to these conservation areas, and they get entitlement to live there and also to make a living by extracting natural non-forest, non-timber forest products, no? So by living off what the forest gives in terms of wild fruits and or fish in the case of rivering communities, etc. So in a subsistence sort of oriented economy, but not only subsistence, they also access the market. Now, the point is that these communities are threatened, because this kind of land management and this kind of life project, because these are life projects that the couple that I talk about in the book, Claudio Maria, were this kind of settlers, and were part of one of these communities. They are constantly compared to capitalist business, no? To capitalist land ownership and land management, etc. And so their productivity is constantly compared to that of soy monoculture, for example, or timber extraction. And of course, the productivity is not comparable in terms of profits. It is very much higher if we measure productivity in non-economic terms. If we measure productivity in the terms that Hofmeister and Wiesecker called the reproductivity, the capacity to reproduce humans and non-human nature, to reproduce, the capacity to enhance the productive capacity of non-human nature itself, at the same time the capacity of granting for human well-being. So if we measure it in terms of reproductivity, it's being measured. There are studies in Brazil that have made these quantification of the productivity of the extractive reserves, if measured in this sense, in the sense of a strong sustainability, if you want to use this term, and it's of course much higher. So this also calls for that it's not enough to have, you know, the most advanced policy. Then you also need a shift in the valuing system, in the system of economic valuing.
Thank you, Stefania. There's a question from Yongfei. I'm sorry I didn't see your hand. I'm not sure exactly why, but Yongfei, go ahead.
Hi, I just thank you for Anna for the interesting proposal. I'm pretty much in support of it, but I find that for people who have the power to like give money to support this kind of new structure, it has I think there will be interest, but I feel like the proposal is not quite connect. How is that the care tax will connect is well connected to the ecology? How does that benefit to the ecology? That is not very obvious to me. So I would like to know how's that connect, how's that beneficial? Like, for example, will that care tax will, like, I mean, the care sector, to my understanding, I think is pretty aware of the ecological problem, but because they are doing a lot of caring and doing shopping and doing all this thing that aware of where the waste go. So I feel like, but they cannot do much about it because the economic reason. So I feel like if that proposal can somehow connect it to the care tax, somehow will directly benefit to the ecological sustainability, then will be generate a lot more interest to support that proposal in the public space. For example, it will have more women to go to have ecological invention for the society, or it's like somehow it's connected to it, is the key. So the taxpayer will understand that that money will directly not just benefit the caregiver, the care industry, but also eventually is the benefiting the ecology as well. That's just like something that I have so far. Thank you.
All right, I'll try my best to answer Yungfei's question. Thank you very much, Yungfei, for this question to this very important connection. So I have two and a half ideas about how one can make this case. If you're a state and you have a portfolio of things to invest in, and you might make the decision, do I invest now in the military or in construction or in sustainable construction or in the care sector, then all of these different options might come with a different ecological footprint. Maybe I should not use this concept because it comes from a company, but that's it. And this is just to give you the image that options come with a material impact on the world and the future. And so in this portfolio of decisions, choosing care might not be as resource intensive and energy intensive as other options. So if you need to spend the money somewhere, then spending it on low carbon care might be a good way to go. And then another possible way of connecting environmental benefits and the care sector was already mentioned by Stefania and Laurie, I guess. They were saying we have a lot of subsidies, so government spending that go to the fossil fuel sector or the airplane industry sector. And if we reduce those subsidies and give it to the care sector, then we can combine two goals at the same time, reducing, giving money away to polluting industries and putting it somewhere else. But then also you mentioned a third thing, and that is that caring as a praxis might enable people to develop a certain value set, maybe around precaution, about accepting the rhythms of bodies and the environment. And it might also sharpen your senses towards the creation of waste, which is usually hidden in industrialized societies. And so if we understand care not as something that is exclusively applied to caring for humans, but can be more of an attitude towards being in the world, then it really is already something that transcends the boundaries between the social and the ecological sphere. So these are the three things that I would mention there, but also passing that on to Mariam and Stefania, who have also thought about this a lot.
I very much agree with everything that you just said, Anna. I think that that's exactly, that's it. It's not just necessarily the fact that there are a prioritization of care over certain more exploitative sectors that end up deepening this kind of material productivity in favor of social relationships, but also the connections that we get from care work itself, prioritizing, again, the socioecological practices, the rhythms of our body, the rhythms of the world that we live in over this idea of capital accumulation. And so it's, I think that in almost like inherently in care work is the idea that you can't make this more productive than the limits and the boundaries of what we are and how we relate to each other. So I don't know if Stefania has anything else.
Sorry, I was just saying amen. I agree with all you have said.
Okay. I'm aware that it's getting late for you folks, those of you who are in Europe. So I'm going to just take the last two questions for our session today. The discussion has been amazing. So first, Ipek, and then Lori. And if you'd kindly keep your comments brief or questions brief and responses brief, and we'll wrap it up from there. Go ahead, Ipek.
Okay. Sorry. Hey, I'm just coming from a different approach, actually, not I'm more deeply ecology, and I'm working with the concept of degrowth in relationship to commons, but not in understandings of late Marxist approaches, a little bit kind of against. And I've been finding like Yongfei just kind of equalized care, concept of care to totally in parallel with ecology, but here I'm also an activist, environmental activist. Here I found in this last year finding myself writing more and more against compassion in relationship to ecology, especially if the concept of care and compassion is not taught in relationship to other than human, because most of what I'm reading and seeing, most of the approaches in relationship to being against anthropocentric without actually knowing what happens in the biological sphere, what you think is care and compassion is quite violent. Here I've been finding dealing with a lot of forestry issues, underwater issues. I'm also a soundscape ecologist. I'm working with a lot of biodata and bioacoustics. Without that knowledge, actually, here it's a really here in Turkey, it's really a large sector, and it's almost like destroying business sometimes. It's some of raised with the animal activists, etc. And I experienced in the same, like, I don't want to go deep, but I would argue with actual cases that care and compassion doesn't equal to being against anthropocentric and ecological at all. And I used to work with those concepts, but this last year I totally dropped the concept of compassion, and I'm more insisted on using the word respect, because especially approaches coming from people of the urban, like for instance those cooperatives. I used to work for a lot of cooperatives. I've been in a lot of urban movements with squatters and etc. But I'm seeing what they're doing, like creating sanctuaries and care works. If they're they can really destroy biodiversity. And when we think about or talk about climate change, we usually talk about carbon levels, but we rarely talk about what climate change is also being created by destroying biodiversity. And that means a lot of microorganisms, a lot of part of the nature, a lot of acts. Like we have allies in carbon sequestration, that what we do actually destroys those networks. And what I've seen in this, especially domestic animal rights and care people, is it's really destroying business, especially, for instance, some food change, they destroy olive trees, for instance. Like it's an immense sector that you can't really say that care work without conceptualizing what care is, what ecological care is in totality. You can't talk about it from my perspective. And I'm writing on it in English now as well too, in parts. I'm totally against using the word compassion in relationship to ecology. Sorry, it's a different point, but I just wanted to add it. I don't think they echo at all.
Thank you so much for your observations, Ipek. I think maybe what I'll do is let Lori make her comment as well, and then I'll invite the three of you, if you want to respond to any of these last comments, and then we'll wrap things up. All right, Lori?
Oh, I just wish we had time to talk more about what Ipek just said. Yeah, I mean, it's the point about how extractive capitalism really is destructive of the foundations of the reproduction of life. You know, I mean, what you're observing in Turkey is observed by Vandana Shiva and others in other contexts as well. And it's just absolutely devastating. And of course, we see it in Canada, and we live in near the oil sands here. So we have a really close-up picture of what that looks like. But what I wanted to say earlier was just that, you know, thinking again in global terms, but in terms of global climate science terms now, instead of global political economy for a minute, what we're looking at in the future is, you know, the predictions are at least 250 million climate refugees will be moving north in the next couple of decades. And there's huge impacts for food production, destabilization of food production, especially in the global south, where in countries where drought and floods are going to be extreme. And so that means that in places like Canada or Siberia will be the places that are still producing food. So, you know, you put all that together, and for me, I think that it gives us some foundations to say that we really need to revalorize labor-intensive work, not only in care, but in agriculture and food processing, and, you know, the provisioning of local economies, right? Ecological restoration, forestry, so many areas where we need human labor, right, to repair damage and to produce food and to provide livelihoods for all those people who are being displaced. You know, what are we going to do in Canada when we could not deal with 6 million Syrian refugees? We took in a pittance. What are we going? So this is a question I'm always asking myself: is what kind of economy can actually adjust to these disruptions of climate change, and from a, you know, the point of view of a part of the world that will be receiving these refugees and will be critical both for providing food and for biodiversity, protecting what's left of wild spaces, right? So these are important questions for us. I had another point, which is probably for another session, and I sure hope you have one. because, you know, in the work I've done over the years, I just always come back to the same problem. What our reforms are actually blocked by, apart from, of course, you know, the active campaigns of capitalist corporations and their think tanks, but what they're really blocked by are our political institutions, which are profoundly anti-democratic. And it's the lack of, you know, we don't actually have the political institutions that can implement any of these reforms. Our first problems are political, right? And so I just wanted to throw that out. It's different in every context, of course. I mean, one little thing I didn't get to say earlier, I just want to throw in. I'm so happy for the women of Spain. I mean, the passing of a menstrual leave, I think that's fantastic, and it's a real recognition that we're not all the same, right? The economy has been designed around this male model, a set of male norms. Men have no idea what dysmenorrhea does to you every month, right? I just thought that was like a huge step forward, and it's sort of hopefully indicative of moving in the direction of prioritizing human needs over capitalist economic and male models of productivity. Sorry, I'm going to stop, but thank you. And just thank you again so much to all of you. And I feel like I've been resuscitated.
I'm just going to invite the panelists if they want to respond to any of the last few points and before we end for today.
You're muted. Give us the order.
Yeah. Same thing. My cursor's jumping around like a bean here. I guess you folks all agree with the last few comments and so on. So in that case, let me just invite everybody to thank our panelists today for a fantastic discussion, really engaging, really thought-provoking, of course, leading to more discussion that needs to happen. And I hope somehow in some way there will be more discussions coming up somehow or other. But I know we're on Zoom and everything, so use whatever icons and so on you can to give a big round of applause to our panelists today for their brilliant insights. And I'd also like to thank you people that have come out to this to participate in these very important discussions. And I also want to give a shout out of thanks to Casey Germain from Kios for all of his technical support and help in organizing all of this. With all that in mind, I'd like to wish you all a great evening, great afternoon. Best wishes to you all, and thanks for coming. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you, Soraya, and bye, everyone.